everyone and turning off the waiting room, and then we'll start in just a second. Okay. All right, so let's get started. Yeah, so welcome everyone to today's very final virtual digital economy seminar, at least before the summer or for the summer. Christian will moderate today's talk, and he'll introduce our guest in just a second. Before we start the fine print, please send any clarifying questions to everyone in the chat window throughout the talk. Christian will manage the queue and interrupt the speaker at a convenient time for you to ask the question, or he could also ask the question for you if you prefer. I believe there's also a co-author in the room today, so you might get replies to your question in the chat right away. We'll collect all remaining questions for discussions in the Q&A after the talk, so don't hesitate to post questions at any time. Today's session will be recorded, so if you ask a question yourself, you'll appear in the recording. And also feel free to turn on your camera to give the speaker a more interactive experience if you wish so. And that's it from the admin side. So I'm happy to hand over to Christian.
Well, welcome also from my side. It's my great honor to introduce Ken Wilbur, who is a professor of marketing and analytics at UC San Diego in the Rady School. I don't really need to introduce Ken because I guess everybody knows his work on advertising and the measurement of advertising in particular. Lots of influential papers, and he's of course published in all the right places. So very much looking forward to your talk, Ken. And the screen is yours.
Thank you both for organizing this series. I've been a frequent viewer, both live and on YouTube, and thanks everyone for joining and making today's talk possible. Can you guys see my screen? Great. So I'm very happy to share this work. It is very much work in progress. We would love to hear your critical questions and objections, and if you have opinionated suggestions, we would solicit those actively, whether it's during or after the talk. This is joint with Seung, who's here, and this is more her paper than mine. She was kind enough to let me talk about it, and as we're still developing this, any feedback we can get will be very helpful to us. Also, Amir, a colleague at UC San Diego, who also has a part-time affiliation with the firm Fiverr that we'll be looking at for part of the talk. I'm going to start out very broad, and then in about 5 minutes narrow in. But I want to talk about why I think this topic is very important. Surveys, serious surveys that try to match observable respondent characteristics to the distribution of residents of the United States conclude that very large proportions of U.S. adults are working in online labor markets, doing gig work, and so it was about 1 in 6 U.S. adults who said that they had ever tried gig work, and around 5% of people said that this was their full-time occupation. There was a serious effort by the Department of Labor in Illinois to figure out how much rideshare app drivers were making per hour. They checked payments. They asked drivers to log their time and their expenses, and from those inputs they imputed hourly wages. And as you can see, it was about 40% of ride-sharing drivers that were making less than the local minimum wage in Chicago. And if you ask these folks why they're doing it, it's almost half who say that they have to do it for one reason or another. And so we just have a substantial fraction, very likely millions of people working in this sector because they need the money. And one of the ways that platforms have tried to supplement these vulnerable workers' incomes is by asking purchasers to give tips. Now we are going to follow the literature, and we're going to define tips as discretionary post-transaction payments that consumers choose to make. Many of these digital platforms are actively soliciting tips. They do so in different ways. The most common approach is a very succinct, Uber says add a tip, Lyft just says add tip, Grubhub says select a tip amount, DoorDash says dash your tip. Sometimes it comes after the rating, sometimes it comes before the rating. There are default recommendations that are overwhelmingly used when tips are given. But we also see signs of a lack of coordination in the marketplace as well. TaskRabbit doesn't make an explicit request, but it does say tips are optional, and 100% goes to the tasker. YouTube calls it a super thanks, and so you can send money. So you can send money to Hannes and Christian. If you use that thanks button on YouTube, maybe they'll have updated that request by the time you see this. Who knows? Clubhouse is a little more blunt about it. They say just send money. And then there are some platforms that do not enable purchasers to send tips or make that easy to do. And so we see these norms sort of all over the place. I've picked just a couple of mass media articles about tipping in the past year. There was another one just a couple of days ago in the Wall Street Journal. Digital platforms not only are making these tipping prompts quite frequent, but also many analog transactions are now partially mediated by digital payment platforms, many of which request the tip before the service has been provided, and do so in a way that is observable to the employee providing the service, as well as other customers or other people in the party. So it's gone from a typically post-transaction private decision by the consumer to sometimes a pre-transaction and more visible decision that the consumer is making. And because tipping is has some elements of a social coordination norm, these changes have led to some confusion. Some people call this tipping fatigue. Some people are quite upset about how often they're being asked to tip. And so this is sort of the broad context that helps to motivate this work. Now, to narrow in more specifically on what we're going to be focusing on, we're going to think about specifically that written request that the platform makes for the purchaser to consider giving a tip. And we're going to find that changing that request in some cases will increase tipping, and in other cases will not. We're also going to think about whether if that increase in tipping is successful, does that then depress subsequent demand? Does it operate as a price increase, which then lowers the chance that someone will return to the platform and purchase? And we're going to not find evidence of that. We're going to think a little bit about what buyer and seller factors contribute to the decision to tip, and I'm going to present some descriptive analysis. I'm going to present 2 field experiments, one online controlled experiment, and where we hope to go next, although that remains very much up for debate. And you know, if we get the key comment or question that helps us develop our thinking, that certainly can change after today's talk. It's a good moment to pause if there's any questions on sort of the grand scheme here, and if not, I can start to dive in.
Well, so I don't think there are any questions at the moment. Okay,
great. Actually, that's not great. That's a bad thing. We need these data. You know, the literature on tipping is quite diffuse. The priors that people bring to this area are partially cultural. They're you know, they may correlate with people's base disciplinary training. There's a lot of psychological literature in this area. There's a lot of economic literature. There's a lot of management literature, and you know, the most so why do people give their money away when they don't have to? The most direct approach to answer that question is to ask them. One widely cited study did that and found that many people gave many reasons. And so you know, these numbers add up to much more than 100%. And so to think that there's one reason that most people tip, I think is generally not supported by the data. So the most common reasons given were tipping being a social norm, showing gratitude to the service provider, understanding that service providers depend on the tips, and then avoiding negative self-evaluations in the absence of tipping, given the expectation. I found this theoretical article by Michael Lin at Cornell quite helpful. He reviewed the literature and found 5 categories of reasons people tip: helping the providers, rewarding them, paying for future service, which is vanishingly rare in the setting that we'll be looking at. Very, very rare. Then social effects and complying with sort of a social contract out of duty or obligation. One way this article shaped my thinking is to understand how tipping norms are coordination norms. And so I worked in food service for 10 years through high school, college, and the first part of grad school. And you know, when I started in the mid-90s in Virginia waiting tables, 15% was the standard gratuity, 18% was a really good tip. And by the end of that 10-year period, 20% was the standard gratuity and 30% was a really good tip. And there was remarkably little heterogeneity in the tip percentages. Everyone kind of knew what you're supposed to leave. And so the fact that these things can change suggests that you know, there is this social element to how these things are determined, and if you've ever received poor service and tipped anyway, that's an example of complying with a social norm that you are understood to behave in a certain way, and so that's going to be something that we're going to test in our experiments. So the same person the following year ran a large-scale survey, asked people why they tipped, and then a principal components analysis essentially reduced those to 4 categories of motivations. 1, social esteem; 2, generosity or altruism; 3, social complying with tipping norms or fulfilling social obligations; and 4, reciprocity, rewarding those who served me. In our setting, there will be almost never any face-to-face contact between the purchaser and the service provider. and almost never any repeat transaction. Therefore, we did not think these first two categories were likely to apply in our setting. We're going to test the second two categories in our first field experiment. There's a lot more literature, which I'm going to acknowledge and say that it shows that changing the default tips can matter a bit, depending on the size of the change and the level of the defaults. There's also some related literature showing that digital tipping is related to contextual factors. If I had more time, I would go deeper. We're going to be thinking about Fiverr. It's similar to TaskRabbit or Upwork, with the distinction that the jobs are purely digitally delivered, and this is a truly global marketplace where buyers and sellers are often in different countries. The data generating process at the sort of observation level is the purchaser goes on the app or the website, they find a provider, they enter their requirements, and they may ask a question, they may negotiate a little bit over requirements or timing. When they find a provider who meets their needs, they pay the platform, the platform contracts the job, the provider or the seller completes the work and uploads it to the platform. The buyer confirms the work matches the requirements, and then the platform releases the payment to the seller. And then immediately the platform asks the buyer to rate the seller. And if the rating is 3 stars or better, the platform immediately asks the buyer to give a tip. And the platform makes its money with a transparent 20% commission on all seller revenues and a 5% commission on buyer expenditures. That commission extends to the tip. So increasing tips is directly in the platform's economic interest. The original tip window looked like this. For jobs priced under $25, there was a $5 and $10 default, or you could enter your own amount. People overwhelmingly use the defaults. For price over $25, they originally had a 20 and 30% default or a custom percent. And again, people mostly use the 20% default, or they enter a custom percentage. They almost never use the 30% default. So first up, I'm going to just show you a couple of patterns out of 4 million transactions, and including about 1/3 of a million tips. This is over a 5-month period, and so our main DV of interest is going to be, we call it tipping rate. It's simply the fraction of jobs in a condition that received tips. The reason we're going to look at tipping rate is because those default tips are used so often that there's just not a lot of extra variation in the amount tipped conditional on tipping. Almost everything I'm going to show you goes through if you consider the tip amount instead. The distribution of tip percentages is not very smooth, because a large fraction of these tips are $5 tips on $5 jobs, or $5 tips on $10 or $25 jobs. So around 8% of tips overall. One of our first questions was whether online tipping behavior for freelance services was related to offline tipping norms in, for example, restaurants. Perhaps yes, North American buyers tipped more than twice as often as buyers from any other region of the world. And we also wondered if there was any seller region effect on tipping, or any buyer-seller interaction. And both at the country and region level, essentially no. It's almost entirely related to where the buyer is located as to how frequently they tip. But having said that, we do see lots and lots of tips from outside of North America as well. One of the economic theories and motivations to tip is, you know, to reward the seller for making a customized effort to meet the buyer's requirements, and as you would expect, the higher the buyer's rating, the more likely a tip was received. Although you know, the tips are not zero in the lower rated 3- and 4-star transactions. And then if we look at the seller level, in general, sellers who deliver higher quality transactions are more likely to be tipped. We also ran a series of descriptive regressions, and the notable thing here is that when you replace buyer region with buyer fixed effects, the adjusted R-square in the data goes from 13% up to about 40%. It's a huge increase, showing that buyer heterogeneity is a strong driver of tipping. If you do the same exercise for replacing seller region with seller fixed effects, it only goes from 13% to 15%. So that's a meaningful increase, but just not nearly as important as the buyer factors. So just a couple of motivating facts there. Next up, I'm going to talk about a field experiment that we ran. I'm going to give this about a 5 or 7 minute treatment. We have probably about 20 pages of analysis that I'm not presenting here. I'm going to focus a little more on some of our newer stuff. The platform was motivated to try to increase tipping. We co-designed an experiment with the platform's executives. There were 4 conditions. The control condition was that legacy tipping request message that I showed you before, would you like to receive a tip? And it named the seller. We wanted to test reciprocity and social norms. The outcome of our negotiation with the platform included 2 reciprocity conditions, one of which named the seller and one of which did not, and a social norms condition. It's customary to leave a tip for the seller's service, which did not name the seller. Now, unfortunately, you know, you think of these platforms, these are very sophisticated firms, right? A few of them are, right? But many of them are not. The testing software that the platform used limited its market tests to 4 conditions. So we can do A, B, C, D test, but we cannot do A, B, C, D, E test. And this is platform-wide limitation. So we were able to negotiate no other tests in market at the same time as this test, and this was the longest single test they had ever run. But the CFO included a default tips manipulation, which added a 3rd default tip, which essentially no one used. Not many people tip $15 on jobs under $25. But this default tips manipulation was confounded with the messages B and C. It was the same default tips manipulation in both messages. And I'm just going to show you some of the raw data and let you draw your own conclusions. This experiment ran 4 weeks. It treated 40,000 experienced buyers and almost 8,000 first-time buyers. Remember, the treatment occurs after the job has been delivered, the payment released, the rating entered, and then the new message is randomly selected and shown on the buyer's screen. So the first exposure to the treatment message is truly exogenous. Any subsequent platform usage during the sample period may potentially be endogenous to that. And so we're going to separate effects on buyers by the number of exposures they had during the test. So these are just the average tipping rate within the first treated transactions by treatment group for the newly exposed buyers. And remember, the confound was between the final two treatment groups, and so I'll let you draw your own conclusion of whether the message may have had a main effect on behavior apart from the default tips, but clearly the tipping rate rose by about half when we used this "it's customary to tip" message rather than one of the two reciprocity messages. When we look at buyers who had used the platform before and therefore likely had some habits, some experience with the platform, we do find an effect within the norms group compared to the other three, but it's much smaller. So perhaps speaking to the difficulty of changing established habits as opposed to motivating new behaviors. Now, after the experiment ended, they reverted to the control message for 3 weeks while they analyzed the data. They saw what I just showed you, and then they adopted the norms message across the entire platform. Now this is descriptive. I don't have a good control group for new buyers after the platform-wide adoption of that norms message, but clearly there was a change in average tipping, but before and after among cohorts of new buyers in the weeks immediately before and after the platform adopted that message for all purchasers, for all web purchasers. Importantly, they didn't adopt it on mobile until later in the year. And finally, if I show you weekly tipping by the new buyers who first transacted with the platform during this 4-week experiment, clearly this is a big effect relative to the standard variation in their tipping behavior, and not quite so much, but still visually distinguishable among repeat buyers as well. So we have more quasi-experimental analysis and other evidence in the paper about this. And at this point, I'm going to show you a second field experiment, which had a cleaner design, and then an online experiment that this motivated, and then I hope to save a couple minutes to talk about where we hope to go next. So later in the year, Fiverr said, "Oh, okay, this is working pretty well on the web. Let's put it into the mobile app as well." So they ran an A/B test. It lasted about 6 weeks. This was a non-confounded design, the same control message, the same treatment message. In this case, the repeat buyers had seen those who had ever used the web interface had seen this treatment message if they used the web interface within the previous 4 months. There was no default tips manipulation, and consistent but directionally smaller increase in tipping among those treated with this social norms message. Again, economically much smaller, but statistically significant effect among repeat buyers as well. Pretty close to the same treatment effect that we saw in the previous study for repeat buyers, but the effect on new buyers was a little bit smaller. We can size these effects and estimate them a little bit more precisely by controlling for buyer, seller, and transaction characteristics. We're basically putting in everything we're able to observe using the platform's internal data, and we can estimate these regressions separately by first, second, and third exposure to the message. We can also use the same design to predict whether the buyer transacted again during the sample period. And for new buyers, this is quite similar to what we found in the first experiment, but again, economically a bit more muted. It's a substantial and highly significant effect on their first exposure. If we pool all the transaction data, it's an effect of about the same size, but of course we have fewer people coming back, and so a lot more uncertainty about the treatment effects on the second and third exposures. We do not find any evidence that buyers were turned off of the platform by this message. If we do the same thing for repeat buyers, we can control for baseline behaviors better by using a difference in differences design. We're going to have fixed effects for individual buyers and sellers, and then we're going to interact the treatment group with the treatment period. And we find a similar pattern, but again, it's smaller for the repeat buyers, where pooled data shows a statistically significant effect, not a huge effect, and that's reproduced in the first exposure to the message, but the following exposures are more uncertain. I'm going to make this very brief. I'm going to summarize a lot of analysis in a short time. Details in the paper. When we look for observed heterogeneity in the treatment effect, what we find that's consistent between new buyers and repeat buyers is that North American buyers are more likely to respond to this norms treatment by tipping than buyers outside of North America. We also find that for new buyers, those who are highly satisfied are also more likely to respond with an effect size that's about the same as the North American regional effect. Of course, there's a lot more power in the new buyers regression to be able to identify heterogeneous treatment effects. So we have to be careful about distinguishing between learning nothing or absence of behavior, and so at no point do I mean to say that things do not happen. So our original motivation is we want to try to support incomes for these vulnerable workers, and so where we've been thinking to take this next is, can we help platforms act on this information? Additionally, this it is customary statement, the meaning of this statement is not very plain, and so we intended it as an injunctive norm. So broadly speaking, there are two types of norms in the literature. There are descriptive norms and there are injunctive norms. Descriptive norms describe the world, they describe typical behavior. Injunctive norms describe someone's ideal or optimal or preferred behavior. And so we thought that it is customary was an injunctive norm. It's been pointed out to us rightly that could also be interpreted as a descriptive norm. And so we wanted to, so in this controlled experiment, the main purpose is to test a broader range of norm statements, including norm statement attributes, to see how they interact with tipping. Now, we did a sort of an exercise where we asked Mechanical Turk participants to tell us, it's customary to leave a tip for this seller service. Does it describe what people do, or does it describe what they should do? And the answer is yes. Most people said it does both, with nearly equal percentages disagreeing with each other if they thought it only did one. And we tried very hard to make it clear they could select both. So hopefully this was not confusion on the respondent part, thinking they could only pick one of the two. And then of course there was a don't know, not sure option, which not many people chose. So so we're going to test some descriptive and injunctive norms, both against each other as well as against this treatment message, which we're going to call an unclear norm, and Uber's tip request message, which we're going to say no norm, add a tip, right? So Uber is very very sophisticated company. Many of us know smart people working there. They must have tested something, right? So let's take them as a control. And so within descriptive norms, we're going to test quantifiable and non-quantified descriptive norm messages. These are verifiable statements based on Fiverr data. And so about half of all frequent buyers leave tips, or about 75% of sellers receive tips. And then among injunctive norms, we're going to say things like buyers should leave a tip. We're going to make this a more nakedly injunctive norm to hopefully avoid confusion. And then within each of these, we're going to focus on buyers, or we're going to focus on sellers. That's probably a good moment to pause.
There's some activity in the chat, but Seung is also great at responding directly.
Yes.
So it's actually my job is not really clear. Trying to select the questions that might generate more discussion, but maybe we'll push that towards the end, and you just continue, and then we'll have a proper Q&A. I think that's probably best.
Yeah, I certainly wanted feedback, but I also needed to catch my breath for a moment. So thank you. Okay, so this is what we ran. We also ran this in 3 different. This is a stated preference exercise. So we gave them a hypothetical situation, and then we asked them to indicate their tipping intention on a 7-point scale. And so the 3 types of situation are ride sharing, food delivery, and online freelance services. And we pre-registered this as 3,000 participants, almost all of whom consented and qualified and completed the study. And so we're going to take the tested norm message attributes, we'll quantify them, put them into a regression. We're controlling for the setting, for the type of norm message. And then quantifiable is only within descriptive norms. We don't know a reasonable way to quantify an injunctive norm. Within injunctive norms, we tested the active versus the passive tone. So that's only within injunctive norms, and then the buyer versus seller frame. And then I have this missing here, but we also have dummies for the type of setting, ride sharing, food delivery, or freelance services. The main finding is that compared to Uber's tip request message, add a tip, the quantifiable descriptive norm increased the stated tipping intention by about 1/4 point. We find this very interesting because these platforms are very opaque, right? And as a buyer, you don't know the typical behavior, and so what we think is possible, and what interests us, is that using data to characterize the typical behavior could motivate a greater compliance with that behavior, and this would be quite a sharp contrast with what we currently observe in the marketplace. I don't know any digital platforms that there certainly are platforms, especially live streaming platforms, that that make a big deal when someone tips the live streamer. But in terms of labor platforms or aggregate behaviors, I think that's much harder to observe in the marketplace. If anybody knows any good examples, please tell us. Based on what we know today, where we are thinking about taking this is to think about frameworks to quantify various tipping statistics on the platform, testing those quantifications against each other, and if they matter for tipping, we hope to convince the platform to run a third field experiment to test a message of this type. And that is if no one gives us a better idea or tells us why this is a dumb thing to do. So to wrap up, yes, we find that platforms can increase tipping by appealing to some tipping motivations, but not to others. There are additional common motivations that we have not tested, so we're certainly not going to be the last word on this. The effects seem to be larger on first-time purchasers, especially those located in North America and who are highly satisfied with the service they received. Yeah, I think that's probably where I should leave it. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're happy to receive feedback about this, especially critical feedback at any time offline, as well as for the remainder of the talk.
All right, thanks so much, Ken. I guess we could sort of take the conversation from the chat a little bit to a more lively interaction. And I don't know, Coleman, you were one of the first to ask a question. Do you want to, if you're still here? So Coleman's question was about repeat sellers, repeat buyers, and how often repeat purchases happen, and whether people tip more because they want to sort of generate a relationship with the seller, I guess.
Yeah, I started with this intuition as well, and there are dyads of buyers and sellers who interact many times. Surprisingly, the tipping rate within those dyads' repeated interactions is much lower than average, almost zero in most of the frequently repeated interactions. I think the right way to think about this is that the repatronage is the reward for the previous service effort. It's not something that we have focused on because it is a vanishingly small part of the market. Mostly these are atomistic, single shot interactions. And yeah, many things I expected before looking at these data were not borne out, and this is one of them.
All right, then we had a conversation about average prices. So Hannes, maybe you wanna.
Well, so Seung already replied a lot. So I had an intuition which doesn't seem to be borne by the data so much. So I was wondering if people here, because the tips appeared so large relative to the average price, if I got that correctly, people here see this as, I don't know, a way of donating, actually, just using this as a way to transfer, like Kiva or other platforms. But then she replied that you found that the propensity to tip is primarily driven by where the buyer is, not the seller. So that maybe doesn't really speak to towards that intuition, in that It's not people from so sellers from developing countries are getting more tips.
I think that this is my interpretation. It's partially informed by the data, partially by my experiences of teaching an e-commerce class for several years. I think some of the prices in this market are so low that buyers order a service with a low expectation of receiving an output of high quality, right? So if you pay $10 for a logo for your Shopify store, it's $10, right? You're not going to miss it. What are the chances you're going to get a better logo than what you could do yourself in half an hour? And then you do, right? Because that person is a professional logo maker that just makes logos all day, and you're surprised, right? And you almost feel like you're stealing, right? If you know, for you got a good logo for $10, and so putting a $5 tip.
Point. So it's a reference point, and that's different. I mean.
Yeah, and perhaps it's whether it's a reference point on price or on expected quality. I think it's hard to disentangle. So yeah, I that's a good point. I should frame it in that way.
Next up, Carl.
Thank you. Sorry, it took so long. Can't unmute until host allows you message. So Ken, thanks for sharing your research on tipping. I think there's just not enough good information. It's kind of a vexing problem to understand motivations from tipping and their implications for platforms. You know, one of the things I was curious about with quantifiable norms is I think it implies, again, no pun intended, a tipping equilibrium, because, you know, if more than half the people are tipping, that encourages more to tip, and you can see, like as you play and iterate forward, that this would lead to mini tipping. But if you are tipping, it can go the other way. And so it stands to reason that initial conditions would matter a lot, right? With quantifiable norms.
Yes, I 100%. You know, something I didn't talk about very much is that we can see clear cohort effects in the descriptives. The time that someone came to the platform is related to the frequency with which they tip. And the platform has moved within the market. It started out at the very low end, and then it has steadily moved up market in the 6 or 7 years since then. And we've also seen that when someone, you know, the strongest predictor of behavior is behavior, right? That's an expectation that's borne out, right? So past tips strongly predict future tips. Those individual factors are really important, and that's why we're optimistic that even though tipping is not very common today, if the platform can motivate new buyers to tip on their first transaction, it could become meaningfully more common in the future. And even going from 8% to 15%, this can be an appreciable difference for some of these sellers. But maybe we should do more in thinking about sort of the dynamic equilibrium and tracing out the long-term path, both in the descriptives. The treatment effects are, you know, these things are pretty noisy, right? So it's hard to show clear differences over long time horizons, but we can do more to try, I think.
I guess the related question, Tommy, on general equilibrium effects. Tommy, do you wanna?
Oh yeah. I might be wrong, but I think John Lees has a paper with his co-author on tipping in Uber. I think you said his paper too, and I think what he found was that when Uber turned on the tipping function, there's a supply response, right? More people would be on Uber, more driver would be on Uber, and then kind of drive down the price, and overall buyers is going to pay the same price in the equilibrium, right? And I wonder if there's any supplies, I may have missed that. If there's any supply side response that you can see in your experiment, in particular, whether sellers they put in more effort or become more available on the platform if they receive more tip in your experiment.
Yeah, this was one of my hopes. I didn't know how strongly I should expect it. We have done quite a lot to try to detect treatment effects on seller behaviors. So, you know, the buyer gets treated after matching with the seller. The seller may get a surprise tip or not. Then the seller may, you know, they may do more jobs, they may change their price, they may deliver a better quality the next time. They may request a tip when they deliver the next job. If my memory serves, and Seung, please correct me if this is not correct. This is in the current paper. I think the only thing we were able to discern is that the sellers who interacted with a norms treated buyer were more likely to request the tip on their next job. But we did not discern any clear differences in subsequent buyer satisfaction rating, in subsequent price, in subsequent likelihood to work. And when I thought about this, I thought about the overwhelming importance of the buyer factors in the decision to tip or not, along with the uncertainty on the seller's side in receiving the tip, right? From the seller's perspective, the attribution of a tip received to the various factors that could have caused it is quite a noisy problem, right? Yeah, we just don't have much we're able to report there, to our collective disappointment.
So maybe in addition to that, and so I was wondering, you know, how much information does the seller have about buyers? So, you know, just the slide that's currently on the screen, you know, if I knew that my buyer is North American, and I knew that that person will tip me, that the likelihood that this person tips me is much higher. So I would always select North Americans. And I can easily see how this sort of creates dynamics in the platform that also changes the supply of tasks that are supplied to the platform, and all of a sudden it's a fully North American facing platform, and that of course depends on, you know, how much information the sellers have, and, you know, how much discretion they have over selecting jobs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've had some similar thoughts. One of the things I've tried to pitch to the company through Own is the idea of showing sellers predicted tip probabilities. You know, perhaps it could motivate service effort better. You know, the platform has a list of priorities, and they for several years, this is public, you know, they've introduced various tiers of seller, where sellers qualify to be in a certain tier, and different tiers have slightly different prominence and other factors on the platform. And that's the reason I've been given that this idea has not risen up toward implementation. But I also truly believe, I truly believe that there is so much statistical noise on the platform. The platform often does not have a clear idea of what is going on the platform. And even these second order effects of platform design experiments remain uncertain. And the platform knows these things are uncertain. It knows what it does not know. And that leads some people within the platform to advise caution there's heterogeneous opinions and priors. And I think this is quite a common characteristic across digital platforms that as a literature, I don't think we have fully appreciated yet.
We have one more question by Jürgen. Do you want to ask your question?
It's more a general question, as I posted there. So I was wondering, the Fiverr is taking a commission fee from the tips, and as I have used Fiverr before, I was wondering if reducing, for example, the commission fee would also be a motivation to tip, or put differently, is tipping really the best way to increase the salary of the freelance workers? Yes, Fiverr is also benefiting from the commission in this case. Does the question make sense to you?
It does. And when I first heard that Fiverr was taking 20% of all seller revenues, including tips, I felt quite uncomfortable. There have been several scandals, I think mostly in the US, DoorDash and a couple others. I did a lot more reading about those events. My understanding is that a big part of the scandal was the non-transparency, and Fiverr has always been fully transparent about the fees it takes, including from tips. And I have yet to know about any seller dissatisfaction around this policy. It doesn't mean everyone feels the same way, but I do like the idea, and that's not something I've proposed to them, and I agree with the notion that Fiverr may be able to increase tips by not taking a percentage of tips and telling the buyer that 100% of the tips go to the seller. That's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I'll at least send a message and hopefully be able to do more than that.
All right, so I don't see any further questions in the chat. Let's see if something pops up. That's your chance to raise hands. If not, then I think it's a wrap. Thanks so much, Ken. Very interesting paper. Also, you generated quite a few questions, so it's always good to have a discussion. And so thanks for answering all the questions in the chat. Hannes, do you have any famous last words for this semester of the White Seminar?
I'd rather not. Well, thanks a lot, Ken, for doing the finale for this season. So we'll go back to the drawing room, I guess. To consider the future of this format here. But it's thanks so much, Ken, for presenting. This is a cool project. So we will also send you the chat. So Seung, she replied to